Justice was once a privilege of the powerful. Then a king in ancient Mesopotamia carved 282 rules into a pillar of stone, creating the world's first written law. But this was never just a simple list of crimes and punishments. It was a brilliant political weapon disguised as order, a masterstroke designed to cement one man's power for millennia. By the end of this story, you will understand how a 4,000-year-old legal code secretly engineered an entire society, a strategy of control so effective its echoes are still felt today. What hidden agendas were buried within its famous clauses like an eye for an eye? And why did its creator need to portray himself as a shepherd of justice chosen by the gods? This is the story of the Code of Hammurabi, and it forces us to ask a deeper question about the rules that govern our own lives. How much of any law is truly about justice, and how much is about power? Babylon was a city alive with the energy of commerce and the whispers of conspiracy. King Hammurabi did not ascend to a stable throne, but to a patchwork of competing powers. Across Mesopotamia, rival city-states like Larsa and Eshnana jealously guarded their own customs and their own gods. Even within Babylon's own walls, powerful temple priests and wealthy nobles held immense sway, their local judgments often overriding the distant king's decrees. This was a kingdom perpetually on the brink, where a dispute over a grain shipment or a contested inheritance could ignite into open rebellion. A king ruling by force alone in such a landscape was like trying to hold water in his hands, his authority slowly draining away with each passing crisis. The very ground he stood on was shifting, and to solidify his power, he needed more than soldiers, he needed a system. This desperate need for control would birth a tool of governance so enduring it would echo for millennia. Hammurabi's throne was built on a paradox. He spent decades at war, conquering rival cities and absorbing their territories into a growing Babylonian empire. Yet this warrior king understood that lasting power could not be won by the sword alone. His true genius lay in his ability to wage a parallel war for the hearts and minds of his subjects. Across his reign, he commissioned official records that did not simply list his victories, but meticulously constructed a public persona. He was not a conqueror in these texts, but a shepherd, a humble servant chosen by the gods to protect the weak and establish fairness in the land. This was a radical act of political branding. Every inscription, every royal pronouncement was a thread in the tapestry of his divine mandate, creating an image of benevolent authority that masked the iron fist of his rule. He knew that to control a vast and diverse kingdom, he needed more than fear, he needed legitimacy. What better way to secure that legitimacy than to present himself as the very source of justice itself? His motivations were a complex alloy of genuine statecraft and raw ambition. A unified empire required predictable, standardized rules to function, to resolve disputes over trade and property without descending into chaos. But it also required that every one of those rules ultimately pointed back to him, reinforcing his position as the sole arbiter of right and wrong. The law code was his masterpiece, a tool designed to bring order while simultaneously chiseling his name and his authority into the permanent record of civilization. So the king's solution was carved in gleaming black diorite, a stone meant to last for eternity. The pillar you see today in the Louvre is monumental, standing over 2 meters tall and impossible to ignore. But the most critical part of this entire artifact is not the list of laws that covers most of its surface. It is the intricate scene carved at its very top. There we see Hammurabi standing before the enthroned sun god Shamash, the deity of justice. Shamash is handing the king the rod and the ring, the ancient symbols of royal authority and the power to judge. This was not a subtle suggestion. It was a direct visual argument carved in stone for everyone to see. The message was unambiguous. Hammurabi's right to create these laws and to enforce them came directly from the gods themselves. He was not merely a powerful man, he was a divinely appointed shepherd, and his justice was therefore divine justice. This visual narrative was the masterstroke. In an age where the vast majority of people could not read, the image at the top of the stele did all the talking. A common farmer or merchant walking past this pillar in a public square would not need to decipher the cuneiform script below. They would look up, see their king receiving his mandate from a god, and understand the profound authority radiating from this object. The medium was an essential part of the message. By inscribing his code on such a permanent public monument, Hammurabi was transforming a set of rules into an immutable fact of the universe. This was no longer a temporary decree that could be questioned or forgotten. It was a fixed, central truth, as solid and enduring as the stone it was written on. The law was now unchangeable, universal across his empire, and administered solely through the authority he embodied. This stone sent a clear signal that justice no longer resided in the shifting interpretations of local priests or elders. It now flowed from one source, the king, and it was set in stone for all time. But what kind of justice was actually written into that unchangeable stone? Yet the laws themselves were a world away from our modern ideals of equality. The very first lines of the code establish a brutal hierarchy that dictated every judgment to follow. Babylonian society was divided into three distinct classes. At the top were the awalum, the free men and elites. Below them were the mushkinim, a dependent class of state servants or freed slaves who had some rights but less legal value. And at the bottom were the wardum, the slaves who were treated as property. The law did not see these people as equals. A crime was not measured by the act itself, but by the social status of the victim and the perpetrator. The famous principle of an eye for an eye, Law 196, was not a universal rule. It stated that if an awalum destroyed the eye of another awalum, his own eye would be put out. But if that same man destroyed the eye of a mushkinim, he did not lose his eye. He simply paid 1 mina of silver, and if he blinded a slave, he paid the slave's master only half the slave's value. The punishment was not for the injury, but for the loss of property. This was not one justice for all, but a calculated system where your worth was predetermined. The law was a tool to maintain this rigid social order, ensuring the powerful remained powerful and the lower classes knew their place. So what did justice look like in this meticulously organized but deeply unequal society? It was terrifyingly specific, but this famous principle was a carefully constructed illusion. The law of an eye for an eye, known as lex talionis, only created an aura of brutal fairness. In reality, its application was strictly limited. Law 196 explicitly applied only if both men involved were of the elite awalum class. A crime against a social equal demanded a penalty of equal value. But this was not a universal standard of justice. It was a private justice system for the upper class, a way for the powerful to settle scores without tearing the social fabric. The code's true purpose becomes clear when you see what happened when the victim was not an elite. If that same awalum destroyed the eye of a common mushkinim, he did not lose his own eye. He paid a fine of 1 mina of silver, and if he put out the eye of a slave, the penalty was even lower, merely half the slave's market value paid to the slave's owner. The injury to the slave himself was legally irrelevant. He was property. So the famous eye for an eye was not about moral balance, it was about economic and social balance among the powerful. This created a powerful duality. On the surface, the code presented a clear, impartial rule that anyone could understand. But in practice, it subtly and systematically reinforced the rigid class hierarchy. A nobleman could look at the steel and feel assured that his rights were protected against his peers, while a commoner would understand that their body was worth less in the eyes of the law. This was not a flaw in the system, it was the system's entire point. The law was designed to make inequality seem orderly, predictable, and even just. It presented a facade of universal fairness while meticulously calculating the precise value of every person based on their birth. So what other kinds of order did this system of calculated value impose on the chaotic realities of daily life in Babylon? This rigid hierarchy was the engine of the entire legal system. For the elite awilum, the law offered a shield of protection and a means to resolve disputes with their peers through strict physical retribution. But for the masses, the mushkinum, justice was a financial transaction. A broken arm or a severe beating did not result in the perpetrator suffering the same fate. It resulted in a bill, take Law 198. If a man put out the eye of a common mushkinum or broke his bone, he paid 1 mina of silver. The injury was not treated as a violent wrong against a person, but as a debt to be settled. This transformed justice into a simple calculation of cost versus consequence for the wealthy. A nobleman could assault a commoner and know the price ahead of time, a price that was likely trivial to him. The law effectively gave the upper classes a license for violence, so long as the victim was from a lower social tier. And for the lowest class, the slaves or wardom, the concept of personal justice did not exist at all. They were legally invisible, their bodies considered the property of their masters. If a man struck a slave and caused its death, Law 215 simply states he shall pay 1/3 mina of silver. The payment was not to the slave's family, for a slave had no family in the eyes of the law. The payment was to the slave's owner as compensation for damaged goods. This legal framework made the social order brutally tangible. Every judgment from the courts reinforced the same message. Your body, your life, and your dignity had a fixed price, and that price was determined entirely by your birth. It was a system of order designed to make inequality feel inevitable, to make the lower classes accept their place because the consequences of stepping out of line were so explicitly defined. This was not a justice system for the people, it was a management system for a stratified society. So how did such an openly unequal code manage to present itself as a gift of fairness to the entire kingdom? The legal price of a loaf of bread was decreed by the king. So was the wage of a field laborer and the fee for renting a boat. While the criminal laws enforced a social hierarchy, hundreds of other clauses in the code reached directly into the marketplace, transforming Hammurabi's government into the ultimate economic regulator. This was not merely about fairness in trade, it was about imposing a predictable, controllable economic order from the top down. The code fixed the price of nearly everything. It stated that a hirer shall give 6 gur of corn per year to a hired man. It set the cost of a surgical operation on a serious wound at 10 shekels of silver, and the rental fee for a freight boat at 6 gerahs per day. On the surface, this looks like an early form of consumer protection, a way to prevent merchants from gouging customers during a famine or a war, but the state's true motive was stability. Uncontrolled price spikes and predatory loans could quickly lead to food riots, bankrupt farmers, and social collapse, threatening the kingdom from within. By setting these rates in stone, Hammurabi was inoculating his empire against the virus of internal revolt. He was ensuring that commerce, the daily lifeblood of Babylon, would continue to flow smoothly and predictably without the disruptions that could challenge his throne. And this control extended to the very concept of debt. The laws surrounding loans were particularly revealing. Interest rates for both silver and grain were strictly capped. If a merchant charged a higher rate, he would have to forfeit the entire loan amount. This prevented the kind of crippling debt slavery that could destroy families and create a permanent, discontented underclass. Yet, for all this apparent benevolence, the state's hand was always in the till. Every contract, every loan, every dispute over a failed harvest that was brought before the judges resulted in fines and fees payable to the royal coffers. The king's administration became the indispensable middleman in the economy, profiting from the very system it claimed to purify. So the code created a brilliant loop of control. It prevented the extreme economic exploitation that breeds revolution, while simultaneously funneling wealth and authority back to the central state. Commerce was no longer a private matter between two individuals. It was a transaction overseen by the king. But how could such a sprawling, detailed set of rules be enforced across a vast and ancient empire? The temple priests of Babylon wielded a power that rivaled the king's own. Their sprawling complexes were not merely houses of worship. They were economic engines controlling vast tracts of farmland, managing thousands of workers, and holding treasures that could bankrupt a dozen nobles. A priest's decree could carry the weight of a god's command, often challenging the authority of the royal palace. Hammurabi's code, for all its talk of fairness, contains a series of quiet, deliberate strikes against this religious rival. He did not attack the gods that would be unthinkable. Instead, he used the law to slowly coil the authority of the state around the temple's throat. Consider the laws concerning a priestess, a Nadatu. These women were often from wealthy families and held significant social and economic power. The code dictates what happens to her property if she enters a tavern, a place deemed beneath her station. It regulates her inheritance and her ability to conduct business. On the surface, these seem like minor religious regulations, but their true purpose was to place the lives and wealth of the temple's most powerful figures under the scrutiny and control of the king's law. They were no longer answerable only to their god but to Hammurabi's judges. This was a masterful political maneuver. By legislating the internal affairs of the temple, from property management to the conduct of its officials, the king was effectively nationalizing religious authority. He was bringing a competing power center to heel, making it accountable to the state. The immense wealth generated by temple lands and commerce now flowed within a system defined and overseen by the king. He could not eliminate the priesthood, but he could make it a department of his own government. This subtle legal conquest ensured that divine will and royal justice were no longer separate forces. They were now one and the same, and both spoke with the voice of Hammurabi. A woman's life in Babylon was a legal contract written by men. The Code of Hammurabi meticulously mapped the entire terrain of family life, from marriage vows to the division of an inheritance, and its rules for women were a paradox of protection and profound control. On one hand, the code offered wives certain crucial economic safeguards. A woman's dowry, the property she brought into the marriage, was legally hers. If her husband divorced her without cause, she was entitled to take her dowry and leave, and she even had the right to receive ongoing financial support. This was a radical form of security in a world where a cast-off woman could easily descend into poverty. Yet this protection came with a heavy price, the complete surrender of her legal autonomy. From birth, a woman was under the authority of her father. Upon marriage, that authority was transferred directly to her husband. She was not a legal individual, but a dependent, and the law existed to manage her as a vital component of the state's machinery. This becomes starkly clear in the laws surrounding adultery. If a man's wife was caught in an affair, the code prescribed that both she and her lover be bound and thrown into the water to drown. But there is no corresponding law that punishes a husband for his infidelities. The crime was not a violation of mutual trust, but a violation of the husband's exclusive property, rights over his wife's body, and crucially, over the legitimacy of his heirs. A woman's fidelity was a matter of state security because it guaranteed that the property and status of a family would pass to a true son. This concern for legitimate lineage explains another harsh provision. If a wife failed to bear children, her husband was legally permitted to divorce her. In a society built on agriculture and inheritance, a childless marriage was a dead end, a potential collapse of a family's economic line. The state, through the law, incentivized the production of new citizens and new taxpayers. So while a woman might be protected from arbitrary destitution, her body and her choices were legally harnessed to serve the empire's need for stability. The family was not a private refuge, it was the primary factory for producing the next generation of Babylonians, and the law was its blueprint. This intricate system of control extended even to the dead, governing how everything they left behind would shape the world of the living. But the law's reach extended even further into the most brutal form of control imaginable. The Code of Hammurabi did not merely acknowledge slavery, it gave it a full and detailed legal blessing. Slaves, known as wardom, were legally defined as property, and the code provided a comprehensive manual for their management. It spelled out the rights of slave owners in explicit terms, creating a system where human beings could be bought, sold, and reclaimed with the full force of the state behind the transaction. One law states that if a man has helped either a male slave of the state or a female slave of the state to escape through the city gate, he shall be put to death. This was not a suggestion, it was a direct order. The government had officially appointed itself as the chief enforcer of the slave system, transforming every city guard and every magistrate into an agent for the recovery of lost human property. The economic motive was stark. The elite and the state itself depended on a vast pool of unpaid labor to work the fields, build the monuments, and serve in the households of the powerful. An escaped slave was not just a personal loss for one owner, it was a tear in the economic fabric of the kingdom, a direct drain on the wealth of the ruling class. So the law stepped in to plug that leak, making the capture and return of runaways a matter of public security. Yet within this brutal framework, the code offered a few, almost paradoxical, slivers of protection. A slave was permitted to marry a free person, and any children from that union would be born free. This was not an act of compassion, but one of cold calculation. It created a safety valve, a small hope that prevented absolute desperation, and made the system more stable. It gave a slave a stake in the social order, a reason not to rebel when every other law defined them as a piece of taxable merchandise. By regulating every aspect of slavery, from commercial disputes over a slave's health to the punishment for harboring a fugitive, Hammurabi's code performed its most sinister trick. It took the raw violence of human bondage and dressed it in the respectable robes of legal procedure. It made the buying and selling of people seem normal, orderly, and even just because it was now written in stone. Yet the laws themselves are framed by a narrative of pure power. Before a single rule is listed, the stele presents a lengthy prologue, a royal autobiography in stone. Here Hammurabi names the great cities of his empire, from and Lhasa to Eshnona, and he recounts his own deeds not as conquests but as divine missions. He declares he was called by the gods to make justice appear in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. This was not a legal document, it was a coronation speech for the ages. The prologue creates a myth, a reality where the king is not a man who seized power through war and strategy, but a humble shepherd selected by the gods themselves to be the sole source of order. It is a brilliant piece of political branding, designed to be read aloud in public squares, convincing every listener that their submission to his law was not just a duty, but a sacred obligation. And at the very end of the code, after the 282 laws have been laid out, the king speaks again in a chilling epilogue. He addresses any future ruler who might come to power in the land. He blesses that king if he respects the laws written here and does not alter them. But then comes the curse. Hammurabi calls upon the great gods of Mesopotamia by name, Anu, Enlil, and Marduk, to unleash a terrible fate upon any man who dares to deface his monument or change his judgments. He asks for their cities to be flooded, their people to be struck by plague, and their reigns to be cut short. This is not a hope for justice, it is a legal threat on a supernatural scale. The entire stele, from its first word to its last, was engineered as a single, cohesive argument for legitimacy. The laws in the middle gave the system its teeth, but the prologue and epilogue gave it its soul, a soul entirely dedicated to the eternal glory of Hammurabi. He was not just creating a code for his own time, he was building a legacy meant to withstand the collapse of empires, ensuring that his name would never be forgotten. That imposing black pillar stood in the city square for all to see, yet its words were a secret to almost everyone. In a society where perhaps only 1 in 100 people could read, the 282 laws inscribed upon it were a closed book. The public display was a brilliant illusion. For the average farmer or merchant, the stele was not a document to be consulted, but a monument to be feared and respected. They knew the law was there, they knew it came from the king and the god Shamash, and they knew that the robed judges who sat in the courts held its true meaning. This created a system of power that was both visible and deliberately opaque. The authority of the code did not come from people understanding their rights, but from them knowing that a single, unchangeable standard existed, one that was administered by the king's chosen officials. It was control through perceived omniscience. The judges and scribes became the gatekeepers of this divine justice, the only ones who could decipher the will of the gods as channeled through Hammurabi. A dispute between 2 farmers over a stolen ox would not be settled by them pointing to a specific clause on the stone. It would be resolved by a judge who would listen, consult the learned scribes, and then pronounce a verdict that he claimed was drawn directly from that immutable text. This process reinforced the hierarchy at every turn. The common person was not a participant in the law, but a subject of it. They were meant to trust in its fairness without ever being able to verify it for themselves. The monument's true message was not the content of the laws, but the simple, terrifying fact of its existence. It told every citizen, in no uncertain terms, that a higher, centralized power was watching, and its word was final. This was the genius of the public secret. By placing the law in plain sight but keeping its meaning locked away, Hammurabi created an aura of authority that was far more powerful and far less messy than true transparency could ever be. But this monument of control did not emerge from nothing. Other rulers in Mesopotamia had already experimented with written law. The Code of Ur-Nammu from the city of Ur predates Hammurabi by 3 centuries. The laws of Eshnana were a near-contemporary set of rules from a rival kingdom, yet these earlier codes are like rough sketches compared to Hammurabi's finished painting. They were often simple lists of regulations, practical and to the point, without a grand narrative to justify them. Their focus was primarily on setting fines and resolving disputes, like a manual for local judges. What makes Hammurabi's stele so different, so revolutionary, is that it is not merely a list, it is an argument. The laws of Ur-Nammu might state that if a man commits a murder, that man must be killed. But Hammurabi's code begins with a 1,000-word prologue explaining that the gods Anu and Enlil called him by name to establish justice in the land. He weaves his own name, his titles, and his conquests directly into the legal fabric. The law itself becomes his biography. This was a profound innovation. Earlier kings recorded their laws, but Hammurabi made his laws a permanent record of himself. He fused legal authority with royal propaganda so completely that you cannot separate the two. The punishments themselves became more severe and intricately tied to social class, moving beyond simple compensation to a complex calculus of retribution that reinforced his rigid hierarchy. The earlier codes sought to bring order. Hammurabi's code sought to build a legacy using order as its foundation. It was not just a set of rules for running a kingdom, but a single, unified declaration that the kingdom was Hammurabi. The real power of the law was not in the stone, but in the hands of the men who could read it. Hammurabi's code was a magnificent blueprint, but it would have been meaningless without an army of scribes to bring its words to life. These were not mere clerks, they were the highly trained engineers of the state's administrative machine, the only people capable of navigating the complex cuneiform script that encoded the king's will. Every loan agreement for a farmer's seed, every marriage contract dictating a woman's dowry, and every official record of a court verdict had to pass through their hands. They drafted the documents that governed daily life, and in doing so, they held the keys to the entire system. This created a new, powerful class of professionals whose loyalty was not to their local village or temple, but to the royal administration that employed and empowered them. A scribe's career and status depended entirely on the continuation of Hammurabi's centralized state. By making them the indispensable gatekeepers of legal knowledge, the king was building a bureaucracy that was inherently loyal to the crown. This was a quiet revolution in governance. Before, justice was often a local affair, dispensed by elders or tribal chiefs based on custom and memory. Their authority came from tradition and community respect, but Hammurabi's system deliberately bypassed these traditional power centers. Now, a dispute over a boundary wall or a stolen goat had to be brought before a royal judge who would rely on a scribe to reference the written code. The old, decentralized power of local judges was systematically filtered through a state-controlled process. Every time a scribe wrote down a contract or recorded a judgment, he was not just documenting an agreement. He was actively transferring authority from the community to the crown. The law became a standardized product, manufactured and delivered by the king's own administrative factory. This professional bureaucracy was the hidden wiring behind the gleaming stone monument. A network of control that ensured the king's justice was the only justice that mattered across the entire empire. This single law forced every citizen to become a prosecutor of their own words. Consider the terrifying simplicity of its command. If a man accuses another of murder and cannot prove the charge, then the accuser himself shall be put to death. On its surface, this seems like a brutal overreaction, a legal system defaulting to the ultimate punishment for a lie, but its true function was far more calculated. In a world without forensic science, without detectives or evidence teams, a murder accusation was a potent weapon. A rival could use it to eliminate a business competitor. A neighbor could use it to seize a coveted field, and such false charges could tear a community apart with suspicion and vendetta. This law was Hammurabi's solution. It was a deliberate barrier placed at the very gates of the royal court. By making the cost of a failed accusation so astronomically high, the code forced absolute certainty before a case could even begin. It deterred the casual slanderer and the scheming perjurer. ensuring that only the most serious, well-supported claims would ever reach the ears of the judges. This was not merely about punishing liars, it was about streamlining power. The king's courts were not an endless resource. They could not be bogged down by a flood of petty, fabricated disputes. This law acted as a filter, protecting the judicial system from being weaponized by its own people. It ensured that the state's formidable authority was reserved for genuine threats to order, making every verdict that did emerge from the courts seem all the more weighty and unassailable. The law of false accusation reveals the code's core priority. It was less concerned with abstract morality and wholly dedicated to the cold, efficient mechanics of control. It made the price of challenging the state's monopoly on justice a matter of life and death. But the stone's imposing silence speaks as loudly as its carved words. For all its 282 detailed clauses, the Code of Hammurabi is startlingly mute on the crimes we consider most fundamental. You will search its text in vain for a general law against murder. There is no overarching prohibition of treason against the state. The concept of rape as a violent crime against a person is entirely absent. Instead, the code fixates on the specific. It outlines the penalty if a man strikes a pregnant woman and causes her to miscarry. It dictates the fine if a builder's shoddy work causes a house to collapse and kill the owner's son. But it never defines the act of killing itself as a universal wrong. This was not an oversight. It was a clear signal that this monument was never intended to be a complete legal system for the Babylonian people. A vast body of customary law, unwritten traditions passed down through generations, already governed daily life in the villages and city quarters. This ancient code of conduct handled the vast majority of human conflict, from insults and petty theft to the most serious violent crimes. Hammurabi's stele did not replace this deep-rooted law. It merely punctuated it. The king was strategically selective, using his written authority to surgically intervene in areas that most directly impacted his own power and the kingdom's economic engine. He legislated where ambiguity in custom could lead to instability, or where a new, centralized rule could override a local tradition that challenged his authority. The code's glaring gaps, therefore, are a precise map of the king's priorities. He saw no need to legislate every aspect of life, only those where his direct intervention would solidify his control, protect state revenue, or prevent the powerful from feuding in ways that could shatter the peace. The law was a tool for managing specific risks, not for delivering universal justice. So the next time you look at that black pillar, do not just read the words that are there. Notice the empty spaces between them, for they reveal a ruler who knew that true power lies not in controlling everything, but in controlling only what truly matters. For centuries, the great black pillar of Hammurabi had vanished from human memory, its laws silenced by the desert sands. Then, in 1901, a team of French archaeologists led by Jacques de Morgan was digging through the ruins of Susa, an ancient capital of the Elamites, when their tools struck something hard and unyielding. They unearthed a massive finger of black diorite, split into 3 pieces but otherwise perfectly preserved. It was the stele, but it was not in Babylon. It was hundreds of miles from its home, standing as a trophy in the heart of a rival kingdom. An Elamite king had looted it as a prize of war over 1,000 years after Hammurabi's death, dragging the very symbol of Babylonian justice back to his own capital. This was the final, ironic twist in the stone's long story. Even in its abduction, it proved its own point about power, becoming a spoil of conquest for a new conqueror. The discovery was monumental, but the true revelation began when experts started the slow, painstaking work of deciphering the cuneiform script. For the first time in millennia, the words of the king were being read, and they offered something far more valuable than just a list of laws. They provided a direct, unfiltered transcript of an entire civilization. Scholars could now analyze the specific prices of goods, the structure of loans, and the details of family law. They could see past Hammurabi's grand propaganda in the Prologue and examine the gritty reality of daily life, from the anxieties of a barley farmer to the legal standing of a tavern keeper. This was not just a legal code anymore, it was a time capsule, and its contents would forever change our understanding of the ancient world. That broken pillar, hauled away as a war trophy, ultimately achieved a victory its creator could never have foreseen. Hammurabi's stone did not just preserve laws, it launched an idea that would outlast empires. The revolutionary concept was not the content of his justice, but the very form it took. A written code displayed in public, administered by the state, became a template for civilization itself. For the first time, the rules were not just the whispered traditions of elders or the shifting whims of a local chieftain. They were fixed, they were knowable, and they claimed to apply to everyone, even if that application was brutally unequal. This was the fragile, monumental birth of the rule of law. It was the precedent that a society could be governed by principles, not just by personalities. This Babylonian blueprint was picked up and refined by history's greatest legal architects. The Romans, masters of administration, looked upon this model and built their own monumental legal system upon its foundation. Their 12 tables of law, inscribed on bronze and displayed in the Roman Forum, were a direct descendant of Hammurabi's stele. They shared the same core principle, that law must be public and written to prevent the powerful from arbitrarily changing the rules to suit themselves. This Roman law, in turn, became the bedrock for the legal systems that now govern most of the modern world. Can you trace a direct line from a law about a stolen ox in Babylon to the constitution of a modern nation? Not exactly, but you can trace the lineage of the idea itself, the powerful conviction that order flows from a central, codified authority. Our modern ideals of equality before the law were not present in Hammurabi's code, but the very stage upon which that struggle could later take place was built by it. The journey from his rigid hierarchy to our concept of universal human rights was long and difficult, but it was a journey that could only begin once the law was set in stone, a fixed point to argue against, to refine, and to improve. The code's true legacy is not in its brutal punishments, but in the profound shift it represented, moving humanity from the rule of men to the rule of law, and starting a conversation about justice that we are still having today. But the stone's authority was far more flexible than its unyielding surface suggested. The myth that Hammurabi's code was an absolute, rigid law enforced in every corner of the empire is a powerful one, yet the reality uncovered from thousands of clay tablets tells a different story. These ancient court records and private contracts reveal a legal landscape where judges frequently exercised their own discretion, where local customs and even the pleas of the parties involved could sway a verdict away from the strict letter of the law inscribed on the stele. The code was not a binding statute for every minor squabble or personal grievance. It functioned more like a supreme precedent, a collection of ideal judgments for complex or high-stakes cases that set a standard for royal justice. A judge might look to the code for guidance on a matter of principle, like the value of an eye or the liability of a builder, but then adapt its ruling to the specific circumstances before him, perhaps considering the character of the accuser or long-standing village traditions. This was not a sign of a weak system, but a brilliantly pragmatic one. Hammurabi never intended his monument to micromanage every aspect of Babylonian life. Its true power was as a symbol, The very existence of the code, publicly displayed and divinely sanctioned, reminded every judge, priest, and citizen that the final authority, the ultimate source of order, resided with the king. It centralized the idea of justice, even when its specific clauses were not directly applied. This distinction is crucial, seeing the code not as a complete legal system, but as a masterful ideological tool allows us to understand its hidden purpose. It was designed to project an image of total control and perfect order, an image so powerful that it shaped reality for centuries, convincing everyone from the lowest farmer to the highest official that they lived under a single, unchangeable law. The stone's greatest triumph was not in governing every dispute, but in making everyone believe that it could. This divine framing was the ultimate safeguard for his power. When Hammurabi declared that the great gods Anu and Enlil had given him the kingship, he was doing more than just listing his divine sponsors. He was embedding his entire legal system within a cosmic order that no mortal could question. To break one of his laws was not simply to defy a distant king, it was to disrupt the sacred harmony of the universe itself. This transformed every legal judgment into a religious act. A judge who settled a dispute over a stolen sheep was not just applying a royal statute, he was performing his duty to the god of justice, Shamash. A merchant who cheated on the price of barley was not just risking a fine, he was committing an offense against the divine will that had established fair prices. This fusion of law and religion created a circle of authority that was impossible to break. The king derived his power from the gods, and the gods demanded obedience to the king. This theological lock made resistance unthinkable for the average person. Why would you challenge a rule that was handed down from the very deities who controlled the floods, the harvests, and your own fate in the afterlife? The fear of divine retribution was a far more potent and cost-effective enforcer than any army of soldiers. It policed the thoughts of every citizen, ensuring compliance even when no official was watching. This was the genius of the hidden purpose. By making his law synonymous with divine will, Hammurabi ensured that his authority would be enforced not only in his courts, but in the conscience of every single subject. The stone was utterly silent on its own creator. In 282 laws detailing everything from the price of beer to the penalty for slander, you will find not a single clause that limits the power of the king. There is no definition of tyranny, no process for holding the crown accountable, no right of the people to rebel against an unjust ruler. This was not an oversight, it was the most brilliant feature of the entire design. Hammurabi's code was a one-way mirror of justice. It was meant to be looked through by the ruler to observe and control his people, but it was never intended for the people to look back and judge their ruler. The law was a powerful beam of light projected downward, illuminating and regulating every corner of society, yet its source remained shrouded in absolute darkness. By placing himself as the sole author and the ultimate judge, Hammurabi positioned his own power outside the legal framework he had built. He was the unspoken exception to every rule, the one force in the kingdom that was not subject to the cold, calculating logic of the code. This ensured his authority remained fluid, personal, and absolute. He could at any moment intervene, pardon, or punish in a way that no written law could ever predict or constrain. The system was a perfect paradox, a cage for everyone except the man who held the key. It presented the illusion of a government of laws, while in truth, it was a government of one man, using the law as his most sophisticated and unassailable tool. Every courtroom verdict became a quiet deposit into the king's coffers. Look past the dramatic punishments of an eye for an eye, and you will find the true engine of the legal system, the fine. For a staggering number of offenses, especially those involving property disputes, broken contracts, or commercial fraud, the mandated penalty was not physical retribution but a payment of silver. And this silver did not go to the victim to make them whole, it went directly to the state. If a builder's poor work caused a wall to collapse, he paid a fine to the royal treasury. If a merchant used an inaccurate scale, he paid a fine to the royal treasury. This transformed the entire legal apparatus into a sophisticated, self-funding machine. Justice was not a public service, it was a royal business. Every time a case was brought before the judges, the kingdom profited. This created a massive, continuous revenue stream that flowed silently from the pockets of the people straight into the heart of the state, funding Hammurabi's armies, his monumental building projects, and the sprawling bureaucracy that kept him in power. The law was not just about maintaining order, it was about generating capital. It incentivized the state to actively police commerce and property rights, because every infraction it uncovered meant more wealth for the crown. The system was brilliantly circular, using the very mechanisms of control to finance further control. So the next time you see a law about the price of barley, ask yourself who truly profited from its enforcement. Fear was the true enforcer of Hammurabi's law. Those brutal, physical punishments carved into the stone were never just about balancing a cosmic scale of justice. They were meticulously crafted psychological tools designed to be discussed in hushed tones in the marketplace and the tavern. The code did not hide its cruelty, it advertised it. The public knew that a thief who could not repay his debt would be put to death. They knew that a son who struck his father would have his hands cut off. This was not justice happening behind closed doors. It was a theater of terror performed in the minds of every citizen. The goal was to make the consequences of crime so vivid, so viscerally terrifying, that they would become a self-policing thought in the head of a potential offender. Why risk stealing a bag of silver when the certain outcome was not a fine you might evade, but a public execution you could not? This system of deterrence was brilliantly cost-effective. An ancient empire did not have the resources for a patrol officer on every corner, but it could build a prison in the imagination of its people, a prison whose gates were guarded by the specter of mutilation and death. The law's hidden purpose was to outsource the work of control, to make every individual their own jailer, governed by an internalized fear of the state's brutal efficiency. This psychological grip was far stronger than any chain or lock, ensuring order not through constant surveillance, but through the chilling certainty of punishment. The Code of Hammurabi stands as a monumental achievement in human history, a towering pillar of order in a chaotic world. Yet its true genius lies not in a pure pursuit of abstract justice, but in its masterful function as an instrument of power. This was a multifaceted tool, a political engine disguised as a legal text. It centralized authority by pulling the power of judgment from local priests and elders into the hands of royal judges. It codified a rigid social hierarchy, making inequality seem orderly and preordained. It reached directly into the marketplace, regulating prices and wages to ensure economic stability for the state. And above all, it served as immortal propaganda, chiseling the name and divine mandate of Hammurabi into the permanent record of civilization. The principle of written public law was its revolutionary gift to the future, a blueprint that would be refined by the Romans and ultimately shape our modern world. But its hidden purposes force a deeper reflection. Laws are never created in a political vacuum. They are born from the ambitions and anxieties of their creators, designed to solve the problems of the powerful as much as to protect the powerless. The stone's cold, unyielding surface reminds us that the rule of law has a complex and often authoritarian origin story. It forces us to ask what unseen structures are built into the rules that govern our own lives today. What do you think? Does the shadow of this ancient power still linger in our modern systems? Share your perspective in the